Well, Nigeria has finalized plans to get more than 5,000 Nigerians out of Sudan by road within the next 2 days. The federal government says talks were in the advanced stage with the Sudanese government to allow safe passage from the country. Minister of Foreign Affairs Godfrey Onyema said stranded Nigerians might be transported from Sudan by road into Egypt. The chairman and chief executive officer of Air Peace Airline, Alan Onyema, has also offered to evacuate Nigerians. But many Nigerians stranded in Sudan accuse the government of acting too slowly.
Caste or something, like you see other countries evacuating their nationals, they're eager, they're showing that care, they're valuing their lives. But for us, our own country is just full of excuses. There is no money, it's going to cost a lot. Is it that the money is more valued than 4,000 lives of citizens, of Nigerian citizens living in Sudan, for God's sake? Though we can say that we are from poor backgrounds, all of us here, but that is not a reason for us to be ignored. We are really pained. We cried to the extent that, tears cannot come out anymore. Everyone has been stranded. There is no hope of survival. Everyone is just running helter-skelter, looking for shelter to survive. And these people, they're fighting. It's like they don't value human lives. They don't care about anyone. And we are on a state of, breaking.
Meanwhile, Labour Party presidential candidate Peter Obi is asking the federal government to expedite action to evacuate Nigerians in Sudan. Obi made the call when he met with the Muslim community in Awka, the Anambra state capital.
Those Nigerians there are Nigerians we have vowed to protect. Every Nigerian everywhere in the world is under the protection of the government of Nigeria. And if they have difficulty, we're bound to intervene. And we, so Nigerians, I'm also calling on those of us who are fortunate in Nigeria to also support the government in any way possible.
We're joined now by former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Bulus Lolo. Good to see you, Ambassador Lolo, and thanks for your time as always. Quickly here, this is not the first time Nigeria will be in such dire straits as to how to evacuate its citizens from troubled spots. Speak to us on what the government should be doing at this point in time.
Well, thank you very much, Suleiman, and good to see you, Ngozi. It's my pleasure to be on your program. It's my first time on Arise, but that's not what counts. To your question, what should Nigeria do at a time like this? My simple answer is Nigeria must have a contingency plan in place at all times to evacuate its citizens from any part of the world. But this will take place if we have the capacity to lift. And I do commend Air Peace for the offer that they have made to evacuate our nationals back to the country. This is not the first time they are doing it. The absence of a national carrier speaks to the challenge that we face today as a country. Now, with over 5,000 citizens, and I put the figure even higher, if you add the Nigerians who are in Sudan of Nigerian descent but have been living in Sudan for generations, the number would rise to millions. But if it is 5,000 that we need to evacuate, we can only do that if we have the capacity to lift. Now, that capacity can come in two ways. If there is a civil component with an airline like Air Peace, that's fine. But our military, especially the Air Force, should also be in a position to evacuate Nigerians in any number at any time of the day. But I believe what is partly lacking is our ability to plan ahead, our ability also to put in place what I have called a contingency plan that takes into account all the components that will be required. And without a contingency plan in place, we will wake up to react to situations as they unfold. Sudan is getting into the second week now of the crisis. We saw how the Americans had to hurriedly using their capacity and capability to lift their diplomats out, but they've also left their other nationals, whether of Sudanese descent or otherwise. So here is a moment for us to reflect as a country and call on our leadership to give us that ability to see our citizens back, especially when crisis is imminent.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, so many criticisms about the tardiness on the part of the Nigerian authorities to evacuate Nigerians there in Sudan. But I'd like you to assess Nigeria's bilateral relationship with Sudan and how it reflects, or will it reflect not just on the ability or capacity of Nigeria to evacuate her nationals, but even going forward, and how will this crisis in Sudan actually affect Nigeria?
Well, you can never say Nigeria is completely insulated against the consequences of the crisis in Sudan, given that the world today is highly integrated. But talking about our bilateral relationship with Sudan, we've had diplomatic relations for a very long time. We also have representation at ambassadorial level between both countries, which is fine. And if you go back to history, Sudan got its independence in 1956 from the British. So too did Nigeria 4 years later in 1960. So we have that British connection. And I alluded to the fact that there are many Nigerians, population sometimes estimated between 7 and over 10% of Sudanese nationals are of Nigerian origin. So there is that close linkage between Nigeria and Sudan. But it ought to translate into our brotherhood as Africans, where Nigeria and Sudan belong to the African Union. And if you look at the structure of the African Union today, the Peace and Security Council has been mandated with the responsibility on behalf of the United Nations Security Council to maintain peace and security on the continent. Now, with our students in the Sudan, and equally other nationals that may have to leave Sudan hurriedly, Sudan shares borders with Chad, Chad shares borders with Nigeria. So the risk of infiltration is there. And the insecurity through insurgency that we are facing in Nigeria is a real danger to us. So where now you have people having to flee Sudan because of the conflict, you cannot tell what the character of the people will be. You cannot say what they will be carrying with them. And therefore, the risk of a spike in our insecurity is real in my view.
Let me come in here, Ambassador Lolo, because, if we go back in time, this crisis actually started just before 2019 uprising that took out the man who was there at that point in time. But now we're talking about two factions, General Boran
Yes.
and Hemdeti. Who should Nigeria be speaking to at this point in time, knowing full well that it doesn't seem as if there is a government in place in Sudan?
I think you're asking me, or you are talking here in the direction of what the conflict today is about in Sudan. And it is very clear that it is a power struggle between two individuals who have behind them military might. General Al-Burhan that you talked about led the coup in 2019. And General Hemdeti that you also mentioned has been leading a paramilitary force, and his background goes back to Darfur. Now, with the military might that they both have and the ability to deliver, it's a question of who is more powerful than the other. But power here is very relative, because you must also look at the source of their support. Are there external forces backing these two individuals? And in my view, without mincing words, I can say you bet, because there is an economy behind the war, wherein some people are reaping and reaping massively. So it's a power play that is not only local, but also has some external linkage. And therefore, how it plays out is a matter of how much domestic support can they mobilize, how much force can they mobilize, how much damage can they inflict, and then how resilient is one against the other. Because it will come a time where superior force and might will prevail. And this is the tragedy, because as that is going on, the victims are the very people that are supposed to be protected by these power-hungry individuals. And I believe that Nigeria ought to be speaking, and speaking loudly, at the United Nations and at the African Union, wherein the call must be for a lasting ceasefire. A call also must be for a plan to return Sudan to civil rule that endures to the very end. Because between the two fighting generals, it's very clear that neither wants to lose the power that they have been wielding since 2019. So it's all about power, it's all about greed, and it's about self-preservation as leader in Sudan.
Ambassador, in spite of the fact that both parties, Burhan and of course Hemeti, have said, Hemeti on his part says that he's fighting for justice, he's fighting for his people, while Burhan on the other side says, look, I'm open to peace. How, honest are these two gladiators, for want of a better word, who are struggling for the soul of that country? And would you say that this whole idea of power sharing is not an aberration in itself and further worsening the crisis there?
Ngozi, how I wish I could share your sentiment of honesty, because if there were honesty in what they are doing, we would not be where we are now. It is the absence of honesty that has brought the conflict to the fore. And yes, power sharing is a factor here of what is it that one side will give and what is the other side ready to receive. Sadly, since the ouster of al-Bashir in 2019, Sudan has not had a civilian leader who is capable of mobilizing the people and who also is ready to deliver what it will take for Sudan to be stable. I'm afraid for too long, if you remember, from 1989 until his ouster in 2019, al-Bashir held sway in Sudan. Whatever there was that resembled democracy was a shadow of what democracy ought to be. And always, when these things happen, the question is, in whose name are they fighting? You talked about General Dagalo talking about justice and fighting for the people. Equally, I believe Al-Fatah al-Burhan is fighting, quote and unquote, to preserve and ensure a transition to civil rule. If things had gone according to plan, by now it would have been a civilian government elected to head the government of Sudan. But unfortunately, you see, by its very nature, power is very sweet, power is very tempting, and once you've tested it, you don't want to give it up. That is the nature of power in Africa. Self-perpetuation is the order of the day. But The question is, what do the people stand to gain by that self-perpetuation? And here we are. It is a harvest of death. It is a harvest of destruction. And I'm afraid it holds back whatever chance that Sudan had to emerge from the woods after experiencing, if you go back to 1959, when they had their first military coup, to today, Sudan has had at least 10 coups or attempts in the country, and it is not for the good of the country.
Well, Ambassador Lolo, quite an unfortunate scenario there, taking us back in time to before 2019 when Omar al-Bashir was actually ousted. I think by three groups, by the civilian population, by General Dagalo, and of course General Boran. I'm trying to go back to how we started. We're looking, first quickly here, let me establish this. We've been trying to reach out to the president of the National Association of Nigerian Students in Sudan, but at the moment, the dire situation in Sudan is almost making it impossible for him to join us on the show, but as soon as we can, we'll bring him on. So, Ambassador Lolo, we're looking at a scenario whereby you're in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and at this point in time, we have two groups that we may not be able to reach out to as a country, speaking of Nigeria. Now, what should the country, I go back to how we started, who should we be speaking to ensure that we have safe passage for the students?
Well, it's hard here because I've been out of the scene for some time. I really don't know what is on ground, but going by the outward appearance and what approximates to legitimacy, the arrangement that had General al-Burhan as the head of the Transition Council, recognized by the international community, in my view, is the channel where we should start. But in diplomacy, we also have what we call a back channel. And it is that back channel that can also open a channel of communication for us to speak to both sides. But we must be extremely careful, because if forces are deployed all over the country, it means it would be extremely difficult to find one of the two controlling the entire swath of the country. So there may be this section that is loyal to one and the other section that is loyal to the other. If you are able, and we as a country are able to reach out to our friends, not just Nigerians now, I'm talking of the P5, who evidently I know have communication with the two factions, then we can use them as our channel of communication in order to gain safe passage for Nigerians. It is the responsibility of government, let me emphasize, to bring out our citizens in safety out of the danger they are facing in the Sudan. But as to who holds sway, I said it earlier on, that with time we will see who has the upper hand. And whoever has the upper hand will begin to take firmer control of the situation in the capital, around the airport, in the airspace. And if one is able to control the airspace, control the capital and the airport, then that is the de facto person that we will have. And of course, I must add, there is the Sudanese embassy in Nigeria. I don't know at what level, whether the ambassador is still here or not. But if the ambassador is, then we can also talk to the ambassador to get his sense of what we are to do. And of course, ours, I don't know whether our evacuation plan includes our diplomats. In my view, they should be out of Khartoum by now. They must not stay and become targets to be shot at.
That's a very good place to leave it. Thank you so much. Former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Bulus Lolo, thank you for joining us.